So now looking at the data viz slider widget, given a run through of the component parts. So let's pop into the graph. Now on event pre-construct, I am just writing a reference of myself, the widget, to the game instance, so that I have got it there under GI data viz HUD as a reference should I need to access it or any of the variables of this HUD from anywhere else. So having gone to the game instance, there we are, GI data viz HUD, which was just added as a variable type data viz slider. That's obviously an empty reference, but then writing and setting it with self stores this HUD as that reference. Now, I've just collapsed this graph purely because the node for setting the styling for the color for the live button is a bit unwieldy. So rather than have it complicate things in my main event graph, I just collapsed it into a single node. Looking down at event construct, so I've done a get actor of class for my data viz setup blueprint, which is in the world at the origin, and then I'm just saving that as a local variable setup. I could of course have done a similar thing to here. I could have set within the data viz blueprint on begin play, I could have accessed a reference to this actor in the game instance and then set it with a reference to self. So exactly the same as what I've done here. I could have done it here as part of the data viz setup blueprint, and then that would have saved using the get all actors of class node here, which in this scene it's fine because there's not many actors in the level, but if that was a very weighty scene, then it would obviously have to go through everything just to pull out that reference. So I need to be a bit more consistent myself. I should really avoid doing that in favor of using this method in future. So note to self. Then next pin on the sequence, I am using this compare data timer by event to determine whether or not the live button is clicked. So it is live data, and then based on that condition I'm doing a whole other set of actions which we will look at later. I just want to give some more context as to what else is going on here first. So, oh, I thought I changed those round because they made more sense. Why has that not happened? Did I not save something? Anyway, let me check. So, coming back to the designer, as mentioned before, I've got a slider here which changes the months. And so that's the one I have two events bound to. The first is on value changed, and then on mouse capture end. So on value changed is when I have clicked on the mouse and I'm dragging the slider up and down, and it's responding to every change and updating based on a series of actions and events that I am triggering. And then when I let go, the on mouse capture end fires. So coming to our on value change for that month slider, first thing I'm doing is I am clearing these two float arrays because I'm wanting to rewrite them based on capturing whilst I'm moving the slider. So the first thing I want to do is clear them so that I'm not appending to that array, so that it's empty. I've got a sort of snap for the slider, which is a function which basically breaks down the range of the slider that I've got so that when I move the slider it jumps in divisions of 12. It's a snapping piece of code. So when that value is changed, it's a float, but I want to truncate it so that it removes decimal points and then creates this value integer, because that value integer I am then using to do a few things. You'll note that I have got a spawn cylinder array. Different things are happening in different setups. So in the setup actor, when I'm spawning the columns, it's being added to the spawn cylinder array, okay? But I'm then find references. I'm then passing that through. So there's the data visualization HUD, which is a local variable because I'm adding the HUD to the screen here, writing a local variable, then adding to the viewport. So I have a reference to that HUD inside the setup blueprint. So I'm taking the local variable which we've just established from that spawn actor for loop, and I'm passing it through to the local variable of the same name on the data visualization HUD. So that's where the data that's being pushed from the setup actor is being stored locally in the HUD. And then we have a for each loop being carried out there. So let's have a look what's going on beyond that. So for each array element, i.e. each column actor, I'm just setting which one is the current array instance. I'm also taking the index number because for each column we are pulling in data from the payload from the Google Sheet to each respective column based on the column name. If you remember, we were pulling in the full column of numbers, values, from column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. But then filtering out using the truncated value. So it was an integer. This integer, then 0 would be January, 1 would be February, 2 would be March, etc. So that's how that little bit works. What we're also doing is from each spawned cylinder, which is being spawned and offset by 400 Unreal units so that they appear in a row, I am getting a component of that actor and getting the world scale of it, and then adding that to an array which is column Z scale. So that's our first kind of array, taking the information from the world based on the scale of the column component in the hex column actor. So that column there. So that's important because obviously that changes every time the value changes. So it's a way of recording what's the current state of the scales on the Z axes of each of those column components. But what we're doing is we're getting the new information, and in a similar way we are using the integer to get the new values, and I've just dampened the values down because they were huge in terms of the column height. So this is my kind of scale adjustment variable where I'm just dividing what those Z heights are and then adding those to a target scale. So this is the current scale and this is the target scale. Okay. Now, when we're moving the slider, we're also getting a highlight. If you recall, the little hexagons were jumping up and down and the dotted lines were scaling. And that's what is being handled here. So as the slider value changes, we're getting that scale information. But by timesing it by 200, I'm also getting the location of the top of where that column will be when it's scaled to its respective target scale. So 200 is the kind of formula to go from scale to location. So that's being written in here. Highlight relative location on value changed array. Okay. And that information is taking that preview highlight, which is the hexagon inside our instance preview highlight, this hexagon here, and it's setting it to the relative location, which is what we've just converted from taking the target scale and timesing it by 200 to get the Z location. In a similar way, we are taking the world scale of the pan matte line, so that dotted line that leads up from the ground to the top of the column, and scaling it based on a couple of things. So we're taking the target scale, which is what we needed, but that is actually from the base of the column to the top of the column. But if you recall, in our actor, we have got our column up here at 0, 0, and we actually have our ground sphere at -360. That's just the way it's been set up, partly kind of involving how the project was put together. Anyway, it works, so I've just kept it. So coming back here, you'll note that we are using the target scale, so that's from the base of the column to the top of the column, but we are adding 1.8 to the scale, which seems, again, a kind of arbitrary number, but it isn't, because we're doing a reverse conversion. So 360 units divided by 200 is 1.8. So on top of what our target scale is and the length of our line, we are adding the height of that distance there. But rather than 360, because we're not doing it based on location, we're doing it based on scale, we have to add 1.8, which equates to 360 units. 1.8 times 200 is 360. And then what do we have? So we have a fade highlight. So we're taking the value and we are fading in the material. So every time the mouse changes, does that do that? I'm not sure it does that actually anymore. No, I've removed the fade because I preferred the snap. And we have a text field here, which is being updated to the month. So I've got an array of months, which are just an array of names. And because, again, the truncated float is from 0 to 11 and 0 to 11, as the slider moves, I'm just populating the name with the respective month as the slider goes up and down. So that's all happening every time the slider changes. So what happens when we release the mouse? So using our local array of column actors, spawn cylinder array here, we are setting the world scale, again on the z-axis, and we're then on each instance of that actor triggering an event. The world scale is taken from the new payload. So when that data gets updated, whether it is live or just from releasing the mouse, we are getting the index array, which is getting our column. Again, we're pulling in the whole column of data. Now this value int is the integer that is the truncated value from the slider. So it's not an array index, it's the same index so that it tallies with where the slider position is, and then brings in the value. And again, we're just dampening it down and setting the scale there. But what we're also doing is we've got the start scale. So this, do you remember, this was the kind of target scale that we were getting, but this was the previous scale stored in an array. So I'm then passing that into a custom event where I am taking that start scale, getting the new scale of the newly selected month. So it doesn't have to be the next month, it's the next one selected on the slider. So it could be January here and then suddenly December here. It doesn't matter, it's not kind of sequential to the data, it's sequential to what's being selected. And then this is what's being triggered per instance on the hex column actor. So we will go over that. And that, in effect, does a couple of things. It does the animation of the column going up or down, depending on the difference between the start scale and the end scale. And also it handles the colouring and the colouring of the mesh based on whether the value is equals to, smaller than, or greater than, and a couple of other things, but I'll go into that in detail. I don't want to get lost in the hex column for now. We're just concentrating on what's going on here. So that is super powerful because that's then taking all the information that we've pulled out of arrays, but then spitting it out on a per instance basis. Okay. Then I've just got a few other checkboxes that are in here. I have got one which is setting a material. So the first one is a world aligned material. The second one deals with changing the scale. So again, just using our spawn cylinder array and calling for each loop. So that's what's happening here on each of them. This one I'm just affecting the column component. And here I am just triggering an event in that actor on a per instance basis. So here that's the event that's been triggered, those two. And again, we'll go over that later. And then this one is sort of toggling between the bar chart or the spline view of the data. So here I'm just basically turning those off and then setting up the visibility and turning on the spline mesh component array that's being created in the setup actor here. And again, we'll go over that. So you might want to kind of come back and forth and look at these videos and sort of see them in context of each other as well, just to kind of understand their relationships. And then this is basically the reverse. So I'm just using a flip-flop to, that's turning one on and one off, and then that's doing the reverse. And I've got another slider here, which, as mentioned before, was just dealing with modifying a tangent multiplier so that I could visualize how far I could push the tangents on the spline. Okay, so there's quite a lot going on in there. This is all redundant. I tend to just put things in red comments. I kind of leave everything there, but it's just something I can then come through later. I tend to leave a sort of XXX in the comments so that if I'm then using bookmarks or searching, I can find those, all of my bailed blueprints. And then last but not least, the functionality around the live checkbox. So here I've just got, so we have another checkbox and then just some text for off or live. At the top of the video I mentioned setting up the styling, so that's what that does there. It's quite a beast of a node, but basically it has every eventuality covered, so the styling node can be a little bit unwieldy, but it's hard to explain. It's just good for you to kind of go through and play around with it and understand what each, it's logical, but you just kind of get lost in it because sometimes when you're having to split some of these structs, then they all kind of merge into one. You can't see the wood for the trees, and ideally they would be divided in some way with a horizontal line or something just to help demark each of the sections once you'd split a struct. So maybe that's a sort of UI improvement that might help give a bit of visual feedback. Anyway, coming out of that and going to the event graph and back here, what we're doing is when that checkbox is checked, obviously we are setting a Boolean and saying, yes, data is live, or data is not live. We're changing the text to live or off, changing its color from grey to red, and then playing an animation that just fades on and off when it is live. And then this is really a variation on a theme. So as mentioned earlier, that timer, if you recall, here was firing compare data, but it's only ever really going to fire and continue on the branch if this is true. And we're only setting it true when we're changing the checkbox. So every 3 seconds it's firing, it's not getting any further, that checkbox changes, and then we can proceed with the rest. And this is, as mentioned, kind of a variation on a theme. It's stuff that we've seen already. But the biggest difference is that coming back to the game instance, if you recall, we were taking what was previous and what was new and storing them and splitting them out before loading the new data. So we have new and previous, and they then become the start and target values for our scale. So here we have the previous, here we have the new. I'm still using the value integer, which gets written based on the slider position, so not the looping index. The looping index I'm using to iterate on the column name of the Google Sheet from the payload. That's CSV info here. And then firing exactly the same event on a per instance basis on the hex column. So it's very, very similar. It's just a variation of what we've done before. So that kind of is the bones of it. So that's really everything that's going on and being controlled within the HUD. So hopefully that's of use. If these videos are giving you some value, then please do like and subscribe and hit that notification bell. So thank you for your support.
Live long and prosper.